The wine glass hit my face with such force that I actually staggered backward, red wine dripping from my chin onto my favorite cream-colored blouse. The entire backyard party fell silent, 30 guests frozen in shock as Nora stood there with her empty glass, her perfectly manicured hand still raised. What I did next made her realize she was dealing with the wrong woman. Tell us your city below and hit subscribe to join our global community. Enjoy the story. Let me back up to how we got here. 3 hours earlier, I'd been standing in my modest kitchen in Stamford, Connecticut, wrapping a silver picture frame I'd bought for my daughter-in-law's 26th birthday. The frame was expensive for my budget, $68 that I'd saved from grocery money, but I wanted Nora to know I was making an effort. After 2 years of marriage to my son David, she still looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found stuck to her designer shoe. The party was at the Blackwell Estate in Greenwich, because everything in Nora's world had to be at the Blackwell Estate. Her family had more money than God, as my late husband used to say, and they never let anyone forget it. Their house was one of those sprawling colonial mansions that probably cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, complete with manicured gardens and a staff that treated visitors like they were doing them a personal favor. I'd arrived exactly on time because I'd learned that being early made Nora anxious and being late made her angry. There was no winning with that girl, but I kept trying for David's sake. My son was so completely smitten that he couldn't see past those doe eyes and that sweet smile she reserved for him. The party was everything I'd expected. Elegant, expensive, and designed to make people like me feel out of place. The guests were Nora's college friends and family members, all speaking in those cultivated voices that suggested old money and older attitudes. I'd positioned myself near the dessert table, partly because the cake looked amazing and partly because it gave me something to do with my hands. That's when disaster struck. I was reaching for a napkin when someone bumped into me. I never did figure out who, and I stumbled forward, my wine glass tilting toward Nora's mother, Patricia Blackwell. The red wine splashed across the front of her white dress, a garment that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, immediately setting down my glass and reaching for my napkin. "Please, let me help." But before I could finish my apology, before Patricia could even respond, Nora appeared beside her mother like an avenging angel in designer clothes. "How could you be so clumsy?" she snapped, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio. "Do you have any idea how much that dress cost?" I felt my cheeks burn. "It was an accident, Nora. Someone bumped into me." "There's always an excuse with you." "Isn't there?" Her voice grew louder, more pointed. "First you show up wearing that cheap outfit to my birthday party, then you spill wine on my mother like some—" She never finished that sentence, because that's when she grabbed her own wine glass and threw the contents directly at my face. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hired waiters stopped moving. I stood there, wine dripping from my hair, staining my blouse, while Nora looked as shocked as everyone else at what she'd just done. "Oh!" she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in what looked like genuine horror. "I'm so sorry, Rose. I don't know what came over me. I tripped. I'm so clumsy." But I'd been a detective for 23 years before I retired, and I knew the difference between an accident and an assault. The force of that throw, the angle, the deliberate aim, that was no accident. That was pure, calculated humiliation. David appeared at my side, his face pale with shock. "Mom, are you okay?" "Nora, what happened?" "I tripped, honey," Nora said quickly, tears already forming in her eyes. "I feel terrible. Rose, please let me get you a towel. Let me—" "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through her performance. "I'll clean myself up." I walked through that crowd of staring faces with my head high, found the powder room, and cleaned the wine from my face and hair as best I could. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a humiliated old woman. I saw someone who'd spent 2 decades investigating people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I'd been making excuses for Nora for 2 years, telling myself she was young, that she'd warm up to me eventually, that the tension between us was just a misunderstanding. But standing there with wine stains on my clothes and fury burning in my chest, I realized something important. I wasn't just David's mother anymore. I was Rose Hammond, former detective, and I had a mystery to solve. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in all my years on the force, it was this. People who treat others with deliberate cruelty usually have something to hide. And the Blackwell family, with all their money and their mansion and their perfect public image, suddenly looked very interesting indeed. I drove home that night with a plan forming in my mind. Nora Blackwell had made a serious mistake when she decided to humiliate me in front of all those people. She'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping for 3 years, ever since I'd turned in my badge. She thought she was dealing with a pushover grandmother. She was about to learn she'd just declared war on someone who knew exactly how to fight back. The next morning, I sat in my home office, really just the spare bedroom where I kept my computer, with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, feeling more energized than I had in months. It was Tuesday, September 17th, and I had work to do. First rule of investigation: start with what you know and build from there. I wrote Blackwell family at the top of the page and began listing everything I'd observed over the past 2 years. Richard Blackwell, Nora's father, was supposedly in commercial real estate. He dressed expensively, drove a different luxury car every few months, and never seemed to actually work. In 2 years, I'd never heard him mention a single business meeting or deal. For a successful businessman, he was remarkably free with his time. Patricia Blackwell spent her days shopping, lunching, and organizing charity events. Normal rich wife behavior, except she had a nervous energy about her that I'd noticed at family gatherings. She checked her phone constantly and always seemed to be calculating something in her head. Then there was Nora herself, 26 years old, Columbia graduate with a degree in art history, but she'd never had a job. She claimed to be working on her master's thesis, but in 2 years I'd never seen her crack a book. What I had seen was her spending money like it grew on trees. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, weekend trips to the Hamptons. David, my poor smitten son, thought he'd married into American royalty. He worked 60 hours a week as an architect, saved every penny, and still felt like he wasn't good enough for the Blackwell lifestyle. It broke my heart to watch him try so hard to fit into a world that treated him like an amusing pet. I opened my laptop and started with the basics. Richard Blackwell owned Blackwell Properties, incorporated in Delaware in 2015. That was interesting. Most legitimate Connecticut businesses incorporated in Connecticut. Delaware incorporation usually meant someone wanted to keep their business activities private. The company's website was professionally done, but remarkably light on specifics. Lots of photos of impressive buildings, testimonials from satisfied clients, but no actual addresses of properties they'd developed or managed. I'd seen drug dealers with more detailed business websites. A search of Connecticut property records showed that Richard Blackwell personally owned the Greenwich Mansion, purchased in 2018 for $4.7 million. He'd paid cash. Before that, the family had lived in a much more modest house in Westport, which they'd sold for $700,000 in 2017. So sometime between 2017 and 2018, the Blackwell family had come into serious money. Enough money to upgrade from a middle-class house to a mansion and pay cash for the privilege. My detective instincts, rusty from 3 years of retirement, were starting to wake up. In my experience, sudden wealth usually meant one of 3 things: inheritance, lottery winnings, or criminal activity. The Blackwells didn't act like lottery winners, and if there'd been a major inheritance, Nora would have mentioned it. She loved talking about her family's superiority. I spent the rest of the morning researching Blackwell Properties' supposed business activities. The company was registered as a real estate development firm, but I couldn't find any actual developments they'd completed. No building permits, no construction loans, no partnerships with contractors or architects. What I did find was a pattern of shell companies: Blackwell Holdings, Blackwell Investments, Greenwich Capital Partners, all registered to the same Delaware address, all listing Richard Blackwell as president. It was starting to look like a classic money laundering setup. By lunchtime, I was feeling the familiar thrill of a puzzle coming together. This was what I'd missed most about police work, the moment when seemingly random facts started forming a pattern. My phone rang, and David's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, injecting warmth into my voice that I definitely wasn't feeling. "Mom, I wanted to check on you after yesterday. Nora feels terrible about what happened." "I'm sure she does." The sarcasm slipped out before I could stop it. "She really does feel bad. It was an accident, you know. She was upset about her dress getting stained and she just— David, I interrupted gently. Has Nora ever told you exactly what her father does for work? There was a pause. He's in real estate development. Why? What projects is he working on currently? Another pause, longer this time. I'm not sure. Why are you asking? Because your wife's family might be criminals, I wanted to say. Instead, I said, just curious. You've been married 2 years, and I've never heard him mention any specific projects. He's probably just private about his business. Some people don't like to talk shop at family dinners. My sweet, trusting son. He wanted so badly to belong to this family that he'd convinced himself their evasiveness was sophistication rather than secrecy. You're probably right, I said. Listen, I was thinking of sending Nora a thank you note for the lovely party. What's her parents' full address? He gave me the Greenwich address, which I already had, but also mentioned that they kept a small apartment in Manhattan. For when Richard has late meetings in the city, he explained. Interesting. I made a note to look into the Manhattan property. After I hung up, I returned to my computer with renewed purpose. If the Blackwells were running some kind of financial scam, they wouldn't be stupid enough to keep evidence at their primary residence. But a secondary location, supposedly for business use? That was where careless criminals often made mistakes. The Manhattan apartment was registered to Patricia Blackwell, purchased in 2019 for $1.2 million. Also paid in cash. I was starting to see a pattern of cash purchases that would make any financial investigator very interested. But it was the next discovery that made my blood run cold. Buried in a search of New York business filings, I found something that mentioned David's architectural firm. Blackwell Properties had apparently hired Morrison & Associates, David's company, for a consultation project earlier this year. My son had never mentioned working with his in-laws. More importantly, Morrison & Associates specialized in historical building renovation, not new construction. Why would a real estate development company need that kind of expertise? Unless they weren't actually developing real estate at all. I sat back in my chair, pieces clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity. The Blackwells needed architectural consultation not for development, but for something else entirely. Something that required historical building expertise. Something that might involve my son in whatever scheme they were running. The wine-stained blouse hanging in my laundry room suddenly seemed like the least of my problems. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's trusting face when he talked about his in-laws, completely oblivious to what they might be dragging him into. By 6 a.m., I was back at my computer with fresh coffee and a growing sense of urgency. The connection between Blackwell Properties and David's firm had to mean something. I called Morrison & Associates, the architectural firm where David worked, pretending to be a potential client interested in the same type of project they'd done for the Blackwells. Oh yes, the receptionist said cheerfully. That was such an interesting project. Historical church restoration consultation. Mr. Morrison was so pleased with how it turned out. Church restoration. My stomach dropped. Can you tell me which church? I'm sorry, but client confidentiality prevents me from sharing specific details. You'd need to speak with Mr. Morrison directly. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. The Blackwells had hired David's firm for church restoration work, but they'd never mentioned it to the family. In my experience, people only kept harmless business dealings secret when they weren't actually harmless. I spent the morning researching historical churches in Connecticut that had been sold or closed in recent years. The list was depressingly long, dozens of beautiful old buildings that congregations could no longer afford to maintain. Many had been converted to community centers or sold to private buyers. That's when I found it. St. Mary's Episcopal Church in New Canaan closed in 2019 due to declining membership and structural issues. The Gothic Revival building had been built in 1887 and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In March of this year, it had been purchased by Greenwich Capital Partners, one of Richard Blackwell's shell companies. I drove to New Canaan that afternoon, telling myself I was just being curious. The church sat on 3 acres of valuable Connecticut real estate, its gray stone facade still impressive despite obvious signs of neglect. A discreet sign near the entrance read, "Property of Greenwich Capital Partners, no trespassing." I parked across the street and studied the building through binoculars I dug out of my basement. The structure looked sound enough from the outside, which made sense if David's firm had been consulted about restoration. But what were the Blackwells planning to restore it into? A black sedan pulled into the church's circular driveway, and I recognized Richard Blackwell behind the wheel. A younger man got out of the passenger side, someone I didn't recognize, but who moved with the careful confidence of a person used to handling other people's money. They disappeared inside the church for about an hour. When they emerged, Richard was carrying what looked like a briefcase, and both men were smiling. They shook hands like people who'd just completed a successful business transaction. I followed the sedan at a careful distance as it left New Canaan, staying several cars back as we drove toward Stamford. To my surprise, Richard pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank on Bedford Street, the same bank where I did my own modest banking. I watched from my car as Richard and his companion disappeared inside, the briefcase still in hand. They stayed for 23 minutes, and when they came out, Richard was no longer carrying anything. Bank deposits in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, at a location nowhere near their Greenwich home. Either Richard Blackwell was being very careful about keeping this transaction separate from his usual banking, or he was depositing something he didn't want traced back to his regular accounts. I was starting to understand why my detective instincts had been screaming since that party. The Blackwells weren't just wealthy, they were actively engaged in moving money in ways that suggested they had something to hide. But what really worried me was David's connection to all this. His firm's consultation on the church restoration wasn't just a coincidence. It was a deliberate choice, because David was family, because they trusted him to be discreet, and because they needed someone with legitimate credentials to make their project look respectable. My son was being used, and he didn't even know it. That evening, I called my old partner from the force, Detective Maria Santos. Maria had always been the financial crimes expert in our unit, and she'd retired just 6 months before I did. "Rose Hammond," she said when she picked up. "How's retirement treating you?" "Maria, I need some off-the-record advice about something I've stumbled into." I told her about the Blackwells, carefully omitting my personal connection at first. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. Maria had always been a good listener. Shell companies, cash purchases, historical building acquisitions, she mused when I finished. Sounds like textbook money laundering to me. The historical building angle is particularly interesting. Those properties often have multiple access points, large spaces for storage, and legitimate reasons for renovation work that requires privacy. What would you do if you suspected something like this was happening? Officially, I'd need probable cause and a warrant before I could do anything. Unofficially? She paused. I'd want to know more about where the money was coming from before it got laundered through these real estate deals. Any suggestions on how someone might find that information? Someone who wasn't bound by police procedure might look into the principal's financial histories, see if there were any unusual changes in their lifestyle or spending patterns. They might also be interested in who else is involved in these transactions. We talked for another few minutes, but I could tell Maria was curious about why I was asking. When I hung up, I realized I'd have to be more careful about my inquiries. The last thing I wanted was for word to get back to David that his mother was investigating his in-laws. I spent the rest of the evening creating a timeline of everything I'd discovered. The Blackwells had transformed from middle class to wealthy between 2017 and 2018. They'd since purchased multiple properties with cash, created a web of shell companies, and were now acquiring historical buildings for unknown purposes. And somewhere in all of this, they'd involved my son in a way that could potentially implicate him in whatever they were really doing. I looked at the photos I'd taken of the church, of Richard's meeting, of the briefcase being carried into the bank. 3 days ago, my biggest concern had been whether my daughter-in-law liked me. Now I was worried about whether my son was unknowingly involved in money laundering. But one thing was becoming crystal clear. The Blackwells had made a serious mistake when they chose to humiliate me at that party. Because now I wasn't just investigating them out of curiosity, I was investigating them to protect my son, and that made me very dangerous indeed. Friday morning brought an unexpected break in my investigation. David called to invite me to lunch, which was unusual. Our weekly dinners were routine, but spontaneous lunch invitations weren't his style. "Is everything okay?" I asked as we sat down at his favorite deli in Stamford. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." He looked nervous, fidgeting with his napkin. Nora's parents have offered me an incredible opportunity. My chest tightened. What kind of opportunity? They want me to leave Morrison and Associates and come work directly for Blackwell Properties. They're planning to expand into historical property restoration, and they want me to head up the entire division. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was screaming. That sounds like quite a career change. What would you be restoring? Churches, mainly. Old buildings that are being decommissioned. Richard has already purchased several properties, and he wants to convert them into luxury event venues and boutique hotels. The profit potential is enormous. Churches being converted into event venues. That could be legitimate, but it could also be the perfect cover for moving money through fake construction and renovation expenses. What did you tell him? I asked carefully. I haven't given him an answer yet. But Rose, his eyes lit up. The salary he's offering is double what I'm making now, plus equity in the company. Nora and I could finally afford to start a family, maybe buy a house of our own. My heart broke a little. David wanted so badly to provide for his wife, to prove himself worthy of the Blackwell lifestyle, that he couldn't see he was being manipulated. Have you talked to Mr. Morrison about this? David's face fell slightly. Well, that's the complicated part. Richard wants me to start right away, which would mean leaving Morrison and Associates without much notice. I feel terrible about it, but this opportunity might not come around again. What does Nora think? She's over the moon. She keeps talking about how wonderful it will be to have me working with her family, how much closer we'll all become. He smiled, but it looked forced. I think she's hoping this will help smooth things over between you and them too. I wanted to tell him everything I'd discovered, but I couldn't. Not yet. If I was wrong about the Blackwells, I'd destroy David's marriage and his relationship with me. If I was right, but couldn't prove it, they'd simply be more careful about hiding their activities. When do they need an answer? Monday. Richard wants to announce the new division at some investor meeting next week. Investor meeting. Another piece of the puzzle. Do you know who these investors are? Not specifically, but Richard mentioned they're mostly private individuals looking for alternative investment opportunities. People with money who want better returns than traditional markets can provide. That sounded like the setup for an investment fraud scheme. Take money from wealthy investors, claim to be renovating historical properties, then siphon off most of the funds while doing minimal actual work. David, can I ask you something? I tried to keep my voice casual. When you did that consultation for them earlier this year, what exactly did they want to know? He looked surprised that I knew about it. How did you... Never mind. They wanted structural assessments of several church buildings they were considering purchasing. Nothing complicated. Just whether the buildings could be safely renovated and what kind of permits would be required. Did you ever visit the properties? Just one, that beautiful old church in New Canaan. The structure is incredibly sound. Those 19th century builders really knew what they were doing. What did they plan to convert it into? An events venue, wedding receptions, corporate retreats, that sort of thing. Richard was very excited about the potential revenue from the wedding market alone. I nodded. But my mind was racing. If they were planning to use the church for events, why had I seen Richard conducting what looked like a very private business meeting there? And why deposit what appeared to be cash at a bank 40 minutes away from their home? Mom, you look concerned about something. I forced a smile. Just proud of you, honey. It sounds like you've really impressed them with your work. I hope so. I want to be worthy of this family, you know. Sometimes I feel like I'm still that kid from Stamford who got lucky enough to marry the princess. There it was, the insecurity that made David so vulnerable to manipulation. The Blackwells had identified his weakness and were exploiting it perfectly. After lunch, I drove straight to the Stamford Library and spent the afternoon researching investment fraud schemes involving historical properties. What I found made my blood run cold. There were dozens of cases where criminals had used historical building renovation as a front for money laundering. The schemes typically worked like this: raise money from investors for restoration projects, use a small percentage for actual renovation work, and pocket the rest. The historical designation made it easy to explain delays, cost overruns, and the need for specialized consultants. Even worse, when these schemes collapsed, they often left behind a trail of forged documents, inflated invoices, and shell companies designed to confuse investigators. Anyone whose name appeared on legitimate documents, like architectural consultations, could find themselves under investigation even if they'd done nothing wrong. My son was walking into a trap, and he was doing it willingly because he wanted to provide for his wife and prove himself to her family. I sat in my car outside the library, hands shaking as I dialed Maria Santos's number. "Maria, it's Rose. I need to tell you something about that case I mentioned the other day." "What's wrong? You sound upset." "The family I'm investigating, they're my son's in-laws, and they're trying to recruit him to work for them." There was a long pause. "Rose, you need to be very careful here. If they're really running a financial fraud scheme and they're bringing your son into it, you could be looking at a situation where he becomes either a conspirator or a scapegoat." "What do you mean?" "Scapegoat? When these elaborate fraud schemes get discovered, the people running them often try to shift blame to legitimate professionals who worked on the projects. Architects, contractors, accountants, anyone whose credentials made the scam look respectable." I closed my eyes. "They want him to start Monday. Then you don't have much time." "Rose, I'm going to give you some advice as a friend, not as a cop. You need evidence, real evidence, before you can do anything. But more importantly, you need to be prepared for the possibility that stopping them might mean destroying your son's marriage." After I hung up, I sat in the library parking lot as darkness fell around me. 3 days ago, my biggest problem was a wine-stained blouse. Now I was facing the possibility that my investigation might save my son's career but cost him his wife. But looking at those research articles about fraud victims, at the photos of legitimate business people whose lives had been destroyed when scams collapsed around them, I knew I didn't have a choice. The Blackwells had picked the wrong family to manipulate, and they were about to learn that a mother protecting her child is the most dangerous investigator of all. Saturday morning, I made a decision that would have horrified my old police captain. I was going to break into the church in New Canaan. Not really break in. That would be illegal, and I wasn't quite ready to cross that line. But I was going to find a way to get inside and see what the Blackwells were really doing with that building. I'd spent Friday night researching the property records for St. Mary's Church. The building had been deconsecrated properly, which meant it was legally just another piece of real estate. But the historical designation meant any renovation work had to be approved by the Connecticut Historical Commission, and according to their website, no applications had been filed for the New Canaan property. If Richard Blackwell was planning to convert the church into an events venue, he'd need permits. If he wasn't applying for permits, then he wasn't planning to host events. So what was he planning to do? I drove to New Canaan early Saturday morning, armed with a clipboard, a hard hat I'd borrowed from David's closet, and the kind of confidence that had served me well during 23 years of police work. Sometimes the best way to avoid suspicion is to act like you belong exactly where you are. The church parking lot was empty, but I parked on the street anyway. I walked around the building's perimeter, noting that while the front doors were securely locked, there was a basement entrance that showed signs of recent use, fresh scratches around the lock, worn areas on the concrete where people had been walking. I was studying this door when a voice behind me said, "Can I help you with something?" I turned to find a woman in her 60s walking a small dog, looking at me with friendly curiosity rather than suspicion. "Oh, hello," I smiled broadly. "I'm with the Connecticut Historical Commission. We're doing a routine inspection of the renovation work that's supposed to be happening here." Her expression changed to one of interest. "Renovation work? I walk Buddy past here every morning, and I haven't seen any construction crews or equipment." "That's interesting," I said, making a note on my clipboard. The property owner filed paperwork claiming active restoration work was in progress. "Well, there have been cars here occasionally, usually in the evenings, but definitely no construction work." She frowned. "You'd think they'd want to get started soon. Such a beautiful building deserves better than to sit empty." I agreed enthusiastically and asked if she'd noticed anything else unusual. She told me about seeing people going in and out of the basement entrance, always carrying bags or briefcases, always after dark. "Probably just storage," she said. But her tone suggested she found it odd too. After she continued her walk, I examined the basement entrance more carefully. The lock was new and expensive, not the kind of security you'd install to protect construction equipment, but the kind you'd use to protect something valuable. I was contemplating my next move when my phone rang. David's name on the screen. "Mom, are you busy this afternoon? Nora wanted to know if you'd like to come over for dinner. She feels terrible about what happened at the party and wants to make amends." My first instinct was to decline, but then I realized this might be an opportunity. If Nora was feeling guilty about the wine incident, she might be more talkative than usual. "That's very thoughtful of her," I said. "I'd love to come." "Great. 6 o'clock? And Mom, she's really trying. I know things haven't been easy between you two, but I think this could be a fresh start." Poor David. He wanted his wife and mother to get along so desperately that he'd convinced himself Nora's behavior was just a misunderstanding. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what would essentially be an undercover operation. I needed to get Nora talking about her family's business without making her suspicious. In my experience, guilty people often revealed more than they intended when they were trying to prove their innocence. David and Nora's apartment was a study in contrasts, his practical furniture mixed with her expensive decorative pieces. The kitchen alone probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, all gleaming marble and high-end appliances. Nora greeted me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though I noticed she avoided direct eye contact. "Rose, I can't tell you how sorry I am about the other day. I was so upset about Mother's dress, and I don't know what came over me." "These things happen," I said graciously. "Accidents, I mean." She flinched slightly at the word accidents, which told me she knew exactly what she'd done. Dinner was excellent. Nora had actually cooked, which surprised me. As we ate, I steered the conversation toward family topics. "David mentioned you might be expanding the family business soon," I said to Nora. "How exciting that he'll be working with your father." "Oh yes, Daddy is so pleased. He's been looking for someone with David's expertise for ages. The historical restoration market is booming right now." "Really? What kinds of properties is he focusing on?" Nora's eyes lit up. This was clearly something she enjoyed talking about. "Churches, mainly. There are so many beautiful old buildings that congregations can't afford to maintain anymore. Daddy sees the investment potential before anyone else does." "Investment potential in what way?" "Well, the real estate value alone is enormous. But Daddy has this vision of creating exclusive venues for people who want something special. Weddings, corporate events, private parties for people who can afford the best." That sounded legitimate, but I pressed a little further. "It must take significant capital to get something like that started." "Oh, Daddy has investors lined up already. People are dying to get in on the ground floor of this kind of opportunity." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, some of these investors are putting in 7 figures just for the opportunity to be involved." 7 figures. $1 million investments in a company that didn't seem to have any completed projects or verifiable revenue streams. "That's impressive," I said. "Your father must have quite a track record to attract that level of investment." For just a moment, something flickered in Nora's expression. Uncertainty, maybe even worry, but she recovered quickly. "Daddy's very good at what he does. He has a gift for seeing opportunities that other people miss." After dinner, while David was loading the dishwasher, Nora pulled me aside. "Rose, I hope we can put that unfortunate incident behind us. Family is so important, and I want us to be close." Her smile was perfectly calibrated, but her eyes were calculating. "Especially now, when David's joining the family business. We're all going to be working together so closely." There it was, the subtle threat disguised as reconciliation. "Behave yourself, or there could be consequences for your son's career." "Of course," I said warmly. "I'm sure we'll all get along wonderfully." But as I drove home that night, I wasn't thinking about family harmony. I was thinking about 7-figure investments in a business with no visible revenue, about a church being used for mysterious evening meetings, and about the way Nora's confidence had wavered when I asked about her father's track record. Most of all, I was thinking about David starting work with the Blackwells on Monday morning, walking innocently into what I was increasingly certain was an elaborate fraud scheme. I had less than 36 hours to figure out how to protect my son without destroying his marriage. And judging by Nora's veiled threats tonight, the Blackwells were already positioning themselves to make sure David would take the fall if their scheme collapsed. The wine-stained blouse in my laundry room seemed like a lifetime ago. This wasn't about family drama anymore. This was war. Rose's story, chapters 6 to 10. Sunday morning found me sitting in my car outside First National Bank at 6 a.m., armed with coffee, binoculars, and the kind of determination that had made me the most successful detective in my unit. The bank didn't open until 9, but I had a theory about the Blackwells' banking habits that I needed to test. At 8:43, Richard Blackwell's black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Right on schedule, if my hunch was correct. He sat in his car until exactly 9 o'clock, then walked inside carrying the same type of briefcase I'd seen him with at the church. I waited 5 minutes, then followed him in. The bank was nearly empty, just Richard at one of the teller windows and a security guard who looked bored enough to fall asleep standing up. I approached the customer service desk and asked to speak with someone about opening a business account, keeping one eye on Richard's transaction. He was making a deposit, but not a normal one. The teller was counting what looked like a substantial amount of cash while Richard filled out multiple forms. Cash deposits large enough to require paperwork. On a Sunday morning, when the bank was nearly empty and there were no witnesses to the transaction. Mrs. Hammond, the customer service representative, had arrived. "I understand you're interested in a business account?" I spun a story about starting a small consulting firm, asking questions about deposit procedures and reporting requirements while watching Richard complete his transaction. When he left, the teller immediately disappeared into the back office with his paperwork. "Excuse me," I said to my representative. "I couldn't help but notice that gentleman making a rather large cash deposit. Is that normal for business accounts?" She followed my gaze toward the now empty teller window. "I can't discuss other customers' transactions, but I will say that any cash deposit over $10,000 requires special reporting to federal authorities. It's part of our anti-money laundering protocols." Bingo. Richard Blackwell was making regular cash deposits large enough to trigger federal reporting requirements, but he was doing it on Sunday mornings when there were fewer bank employees around to notice patterns. I thanked the representative and left without opening an account, my mind racing. If Richard was depositing more than $10,000 in cash every week, where was all that money coming from? His supposed real estate development company didn't have any visible revenue streams. But more importantly, those federal reports would create a paper trail. If I could prove the Blackwells were running a fraud scheme, federal investigators would already have documentation of suspicious financial activity. I drove home and spent the rest of Sunday creating a comprehensive timeline of everything I'd discovered. The pattern was becoming clear. The Blackwells had started their operation sometime in late 2017, used the profits to upgrade their lifestyle and purchase the Greenwich Mansion, then expanded the scheme by acquiring church properties and bringing in outside investors. David's consultation work had given them architectural credibility for their fake renovation projects. Now they wanted him as a full-time employee, probably to provide ongoing legitimacy while they bilked investors out of millions. My phone rang at 3 p.m. David's voice was tight with stress when I answered. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" "Of course, honey. What's wrong?" "It's about tomorrow, about starting work with Richard. Something's bothering me, and I need someone to talk it through with." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in David's living room while he paced nervously in front of the fireplace. Nora was nowhere to be seen, which was probably for the best. "I went to the office this morning to clean out my desk," David said. "Mr. Morrison wanted to know why I was leaving so suddenly, and when I told him about the Blackwell opportunity, his reaction was strange." "Strange how?" He asked if I'd done any background research on Blackwell properties. When I said no, he pulled up their website and started asking questions about their portfolio. "Mom, they claim to have developed dozens of properties, but Morrison recognized some of the photos. They're buildings his firm worked on for other developers." My heart started pounding. What did Mr. Morrison say about that? He thinks they're using stolen photos to make their company look more successful than it really is. He asked if I'd actually visited any of their completed projects or met any of their previous clients. David slumped into a chair, looking miserable. "I haven't, Mom. I've taken everything Richard told me at face value because he's family. But what if Mr. Morrison is right? What if I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my career?" This was my opening, but I had to be careful. If I pushed too hard, David might defend the Blackwells out of loyalty to Nora. "What does your gut tell you?" I asked gently. "My gut tells me something's off. The salary Richard offered is too high for a startup division. The timeline is too rushed, and," he hesitated, promise you won't repeat this to anyone?" "Of course." Nora's been acting strange about the whole thing. She keeps asking if I've signed the employment contract yet, if I've given Mr. Morrison notice, if there's any way I could change my mind. It's like she's nervous about something. Because she knows you're walking into a trap, I thought. Out loud, I said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to postpone starting tomorrow and do some actual research first." But Nora will be furious. "And Richard is expecting me at 9 a.m. for the investor presentation." "David, can I ask you something? In all the time you've known Richard, have you ever actually seen him conduct legitimate business? Visited his office, met his employees, reviewed contracts for projects he's completed?" David was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "I haven't. Every time I've asked about visiting the office, there's been some reason why it wasn't convenient. Construction, renovations, security issues. Honey, what if the reason you've never seen his office is because there isn't one?" The words hung in the air between us. I could see David processing the implications, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally fear. "You think they're scamming people? I think you should trust your instincts and postpone starting work until you can verify that everything is what it appears to be." David pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Richard now." But before he could dial, the front door opened and Nora walked in, her arms full of shopping bags and her face bright with artificial cheer. "David, I saw your car out front, Mom Rose." Her smile faltered slightly when she noticed our serious expressions. "Is everything okay?" "Actually, no," David said, setting down his phone. "I've been having second thoughts about starting work tomorrow." The shopping bags hit the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. "Second thoughts?" Nora's voice was carefully controlled, but I caught the edge of panic underneath. "What kind of second thoughts?" "I want to do some research on the company first. Visit the office, meet the team, review some of their completed projects. But Daddy's expecting you tomorrow morning. The investors are—" She caught herself mid-sentence. "The investors are what, Nora?" I asked quietly. She looked between David and me, and for a moment I saw the calculation behind her pretty facade. She was deciding how much to reveal, how much to lie about, how to manipulate this situation back under control. "The investors are very excited to meet David," she said finally. "Daddy has been talking about him for weeks. It would be terribly embarrassing if he didn't show up." "More embarrassing than David getting involved in something that could destroy his career?" I asked. Nora's eyes snapped to mine, and I saw real anger there for the first time. "What exactly are you implying, Rose?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm suggesting that any legitimate business would welcome due diligence from a potential employee." "David," Nora turned to her husband, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "you're letting your mother's paranoia poison your mind. Daddy has done everything to welcome you into the family business, and this is how you repay him?" But David was looking at his wife with new eyes. "Nora, why are you so upset about me wanting to research the company first?" Because it shows a lack of trust, a lack of faith in my family. Or it shows good business sense," David said slowly, "the kind of sense that would have prevented me from making a serious mistake." I watched Nora realize that she was losing control of the situation. Her carefully maintained mask began to slip, revealing something calculating and desperate underneath. "Fine," she said, her voice turning cold. "But don't expect Daddy to hold the position open if you're going to be difficult about this." And there it was, the threat delivered with a smile, just like the wine glass at the party. But this time, David heard it for what it was. Monday morning, instead of starting his new job with Blackwell Properties, David called in sick and met me at a coffee shop in downtown Stamford. He looked like he hadn't slept, but there was a clarity in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months. "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday," he began, "about never actually seeing Richard conduct real business. So I spent last night trying to find evidence that Blackwell Properties is a legitimate company." He pulled out a folder thick with printed documents. "I couldn't find any, Mom. No completed projects, no building permits, no contracts with contractors or suppliers. Their business address is a mail forwarding service. Their phone number goes to an answering service." "What did you tell Nora?" "The truth, that I was postponing the job until I could verify the company was legitimate." His voice was grim. She didn't take it well. That was an understatement, judging by the 3 increasingly frantic voicemails Nora had left on my phone overnight. "She's been calling and texting since 6 this morning," David continued, "saying her father is furious, that I've embarrassed the family, that there will be consequences for my betrayal." Consequences? She was vague about specifics, but the tone was definitely threatening. He looked up at me with something like admiration. "Mom, how did you know? What made you suspicious of them?" I decided it was time to tell him everything. About my investigation, about the shell companies, about the church visits, and the cash deposits. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "So you think they were planning to use me as a front for money laundering?" he asked when I finished. "I think they were planning to use you as a scapegoat. Get your name on all the legitimate paperwork, then disappear when the scheme collapsed, leaving you to face fraud charges." David's phone buzzed with another text from Nora. He glanced at it, and his face darkened. "What does it say?" "She wants me to meet her father at the church in New Canaan at noon. She says if I don't come, I'll regret it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "David, you can't go to that meeting." "Actually, I think I should, but not alone, and not unarmed with information." He leaned forward intently. "Mom, you said you think they're using that church for their money laundering operation. If I can get inside, maybe I can find evidence." "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous not to. If we're right about this, they're probably planning to cut their losses and run, which means destroying any evidence that could implicate them and making sure anyone who could testify against them is discredited." He was right, but that didn't make me feel any better about it. "If you're determined to do this," I said, "then we do it right. No going in blind, no heroics." I called Maria Santos and explained the situation. She agreed to position herself nearby with backup, ready to move if things went wrong. It wasn't an official police operation, but Maria knew enough cops who worked financial crimes to make some calls. At 11:30, David and I drove separately to New Canaan. I parked where I could watch the church entrance, while David approached the building directly. The plan was simple. David would go to the meeting, keep Richard talking while I called Maria if anything dangerous developed, and try to gather evidence about the scheme. What I wasn't expecting was for Nora to be waiting in the parking lot when David arrived. I watched through binoculars as she got out of her car and approached David aggressively. Even from a distance, I could see she was angry. Their conversation grew heated quickly, with Nora gesturing wildly and David standing his ground. Then Richard emerged from the church basement, followed by 2 men I didn't recognize. Both looked like the kind of people you hired when you needed problems to disappear permanently. I was reaching for my phone to call Maria when David's voice came through loud and clear across the parking lot. "So you admit it's all fake? The company, the investors, the renovation projects?" Richard's response was quieter, but I caught the word consequences and saw him nod to the 2 men. That's when I stopped being a concerned mother and became a cop again. I started my car and drove directly into the church parking lot, pulling up beside the group with my windows down and a bright smile on my face. "David, there you are. I was worried when you didn't answer your phone." I got out of the car and approached the group like I was completely oblivious to the tension. "Richard, Nora, how lovely to see you." The 2 strangers took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with having a witness to whatever they'd been planning. "Rose," Richard's voice was carefully controlled. "This is a private business meeting." "Oh, I'm sorry." "David, are you ready to go? We have that appointment with Detective Santos in 20 minutes. I watched Richard's face go pale at the mention of a detective. "Detective Santos?" Nora's voice cracked slightly. "She's helping us with some research into historical property investments," I said cheerfully. "Such a fascinating area of law enforcement. Financial crimes involving real estate development." One of the strangers whispered something to Richard, who nodded grimly. "We'll continue this conversation another time," Richard said to David, "when we have more privacy." "Actually," David said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I think this conversation is over permanently. I won't be working for Blackwell Properties." "David," Nora stepped forward, her face desperate. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly. I'm protecting myself from being used as a front for your family's criminal activities." The word criminal seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Richard's face flushed with anger, but he controlled himself with visible effort. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly. "Both of you. The only mistake," I said pleasantly, "would be continuing to threaten my son when Detective Santos is expecting to hear from us in 15 minutes. The two strangers were already walking toward their car. Richard followed them after giving David one last, threatening look. Nora remained standing in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face. But when she looked at David, there was something cold and calculating in her expression that chilled me to the bone. "You chose her over me," she said to David. "You'll regret that decision." As we drove away from the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just declared war on people who played by very different rules than we did. But for the first time in weeks, David looked like himself again, alert, determined, and finally aware of the danger he'd been walking toward. "What's our next move?" he asked. I smiled grimly. "Now we finish what they started. We take everything we've learned and we make sure these people can't hurt anyone else." The Blackwells had made two critical mistakes. First, they'd underestimated a mother's determination to protect her child. Second, they'd picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to fight back. Sakin, Tuesday morning, brought news that confirmed my worst fears about the Blackwell family. Maria Santos called at 7 a.m. with an update from her contacts in financial crimes. "Rose, you need to hear this. We ran preliminary checks on the names you gave me, and Richard Blackwell's real name is Robert Brennan. He's got priors, fraud charges in Florida that were dismissed on technicalities, and he was investigated for running a Ponzi scheme in Arizona before disappearing in 2016. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table. So this whole identity is fake? The Blackwell family moved to Connecticut in 2017 with new Social Security numbers and fabricated financial histories. This isn't their first rodeo, Rose. They're professional con artists. That meant Nora had been lying about everything. Her background, her education, probably even her age. David had married a complete stranger who'd been playing a role for 3 years. "There's more," Maria continued. "We traced some of the investors who've put money into Blackwell properties. 2 of them reported suspicious activity to their banks last month. They're starting to ask questions about where their money went. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $3.5 million from at least 8 different investors." I felt sick. The Blackwells weren't just running a small-time scam. They were stealing millions from people who trusted them, and they'd been planning to use David as their fall guy when it all collapsed. "Maria, how long before the federal investigators move on this?" "If I had to guess, maybe a week. The banks have already filed suspicious activity reports, and with Robert's criminal history, it won't take long for them to connect the dots, which meant the Blackwells would run soon, probably within days. But first, they'd want to neutralize any witnesses who could testify against them. Witnesses like David and me. After hanging up with Maria, I called David immediately. "Honey, don't go to work today. Don't go to your apartment. Come to my house right now." "Mom? What's wrong?" I told him everything Maria had discovered. By the time I finished, David was silent for so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. "David, I'm here. I'm just processing. My wife has been lying about everything for 3 years. Her name, her background, her family. Everything I thought I knew about the person I married was fabricated. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know how much you loved her." "Did I, though? How can you love someone who never really existed?" His voice was hollow with shock. "Mom, what if they come after us?" "They come. If they're professional criminals and they know we can identify them, they won't get the chance," I interrupted. "We're going to finish this today." David arrived at my house 20 minutes later, looking haggard and defeated. I handed him a cup of coffee and the file I'd been building on the Blackwell family. "Here's what we're going to do," I said. "We're going to gather every piece of evidence we have, take it to the FBI office in New Haven, and make sure these people are arrested before they can disappear again." "What about Nora? I mean, whatever her real name is." "What about her? She's still legally my wife. What happens to her when all this comes out?" I looked at my son, still trying to protect someone who'd spent 3 years lying to him and planning to destroy his life. That's the kind of good heart that had made him vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. "David, she made her choices. She chose to participate in a scheme that would have ruined your career and possibly sent you to prison. Your loyalty should be to yourself now." We spent the morning organizing evidence and preparing statements. I documented everything I'd observed. The shell companies, the cash deposits, the fake business activities, the threats against David. David provided details about his consultation work and the job offer that had seemed too good to be true. At noon, we were ready to drive to New Haven when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Nora standing on my front porch. She was alone, and she looked genuinely distressed. No makeup, her hair uncombed, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual designer clothes. "Don't answer it," David said immediately. But something about her appearance made me curious. "Stay back from the door," I told David, "but let me see what she wants." I opened the door just wide enough to speak with her, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Hello, Nora." "Rose, please. I need to talk to you and David. It's important. I think you've said enough already. You don't understand. I'm not who you think I am, but I'm also not who they think I am." Her voice was shaking. "I need help." Against my better judgment, I let her in. She walked into my living room where David was standing with his arms crossed, his face cold with anger. "Talk," I said, "but make it quick. My real name is Nina Brennan. Robert is my father, but Patricia isn't my mother. My mother died when I was 16, and Robert remarried Patricia 6 months later. Patricia brought her own daughter into the family, another girl named Nina who was my age." She sat down without being invited, her hands trembling as she continued. "When Robert decided to reinvent himself as Richard Blackwell, he needed a daughter to complete the family image. But he chose Patricia's daughter to be Nora Blackwell. I was supposed to disappear." I felt David stiffen beside me, but I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean, disappear?" "Robert planned to kill me and assume my identity himself when they moved to Connecticut. But Patricia convinced him that having 2 young women would be better for the con. One to marry into a respectable family, one to work the social angles." "So you're saying there are 2 Noras?" David's voice was carefully controlled. "There are 2 Ninas. I'm the real daughter. She's the stepdaughter who's been using my identity for 3 years. Nina looked directly at David. "I married you under false pretenses, but I did fall in love with you. That was never part of the plan." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Either she was the most gifted actress I'd ever met, or she was telling the truth. "Why are you telling us this now?" I asked. "Because Robert and Patricia are planning to run. Tonight. They're going to empty the investors' accounts, torch the church to destroy evidence, and disappear. But first, they're planning to stage an accident that kills both of you." The room went dead silent. "An accident?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "A gas leak in Rose's house. You're both supposed to die in the explosion this evening. By tomorrow morning, Robert, Patricia, and the other Nina will be on a plane to South America with new identities." I looked at David, then back at Nina. "Why should we believe you?" "Because I'm risking my life to warn you. If Robert finds out I'm here, he'll kill me too." She pulled out her phone and showed us a text message. "This came from Patricia 20 minutes ago. Package delivery at sunset. Be ready to travel." Package delivery. That was probably code for the planned murder. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "I want to help you stop them. I have evidence, bank account numbers, investor lists, recordings of Robert planning the whole thing. But I need your help to get it to the authorities before tonight." I looked at David. His face was a mixture of betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been hope. "If we help you," I said, "what happens to your marriage to David?" Nina's face crumpled. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I lied about everything except loving him. But even if David can never forgive me, I can't let Robert hurt him." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where's this evidence?" "Hidden in the church basement. Robert thinks I don't know where he keeps the financial records, but I've been copying everything for months. I was planning to use it as insurance if he ever tried to eliminate me. I made a decision that probably should have terrified me. We're going to get that evidence," I said. "All of it. And then we're going to make sure your father never hurts anyone again." Because if Nina was telling the truth, we had about 6 hours before Robert Brennan tried to kill us. And if she was lying, we were about to walk directly into a trap that would finish what the Blackwells had started. The church basement was exactly what I'd expected from a family of professional criminals, a makeshift command center for coordinating financial fraud on a massive scale. Nina led us through the basement entrance using a key she'd stolen from Patricia's purse. The space had been divided into 3 areas: a conference room with whiteboards covered in investor names and account numbers, a communications center with multiple phones and computers, and a storage area filled with boxes of documents. The financial records are in those filing cabinets. Nina pointed toward a wall of metal cabinets that looked like they'd been salvaged from a closing business. The investor contracts are in the boxes, and Robert keeps recordings of all his phone calls with investors on that computer. David and I began systematically photographing documents while Nina copied files from the computer. What we found was worse than I'd imagined. The Blackwells, or Brennans, had been running multiple scams simultaneously. The historical property restoration was just one scheme. They'd also been selling fake investment opportunities in renewable energy projects, luxury vacation properties, and cryptocurrency mining operations. "David, look at this." I called him over to a whiteboard titled Phase 3 Implementation. The board showed a timeline for expanding their operations to include at least 50 more investors, with David's name listed as Architectural Director, and a note that read, "Establish credibility for major expansion." They weren't just planning to use you as a scapegoat, I realized. They were planning to use your reputation to bring in much larger investors. Nina looked up from the computer. "There's more. Robert has been blackmailing some of the investors who tried to withdraw their money. He has private investigators who dig up dirt on anyone who becomes a problem." She showed us files containing personal information on investors, extramarital affairs, tax evasion, business improprieties, anything that could be used to keep people quiet when they started asking questions about their investments. "This is how he's kept the scheme running for so long," I said. "Anyone who threatens to expose him gets threatened in return." We worked quickly, documenting everything we could find. But as we photographed the last of the financial records, I heard car doors slamming in the parking lot above us. "Someone's here," I whispered. Nina's face went white. "They're not supposed to be back until tonight." I moved to the basement window and looked out carefully. Richard Blackwell's sedan was in the parking lot, along with a van I didn't recognize. 4 people were walking toward the church entrance. Richard, Patricia, another woman who looked remarkably like Nina, and a man I'd never seen before. "We need to get out of here," David said urgently. But Nina was shaking her head. "There's only one exit from this basement, and they're coming in the front entrance. We're trapped." I thought quickly. The basement was large, with several storage areas that might provide hiding places. But if they were here to destroy evidence before leaving town, they'd search every inch of this space. "Nina, is there anything else we need to get?" "The safe." She pointed toward a corner where a small safe was partially hidden behind boxes. "Robert keeps backup drives with all the financial records in there. If we can get those drives, we'll have everything." "Do you know the combination?" "It's Patricia's birthday." "But if they catch us down here?" Footsteps were echoing through the church above us. Richard's voice carried through the floorboards, giving instructions to someone about cleaning up loose ends. I made a decision that went against every survival instinct I had. "David, Nina, get those drives. I'm going upstairs." "Mom, are you insane? They don't know we're here yet. If I create a distraction, you can get the evidence and escape through the basement entrance." "Absolutely not. We're not leaving you." But I was already moving toward the basement stairs. "Get those drives and get out. Call Maria Santos the moment you're clear. If something happens to me, make sure this evidence gets to the FBI." I climbed the basement stairs and emerged into the church's main sanctuary. Richard was standing near the altar with the man I didn't recognize, while Patricia and the other woman, the fake Nora, were carrying gasoline cans toward the basement entrance. Perfect. They were planning to burn the evidence tonight, just as Nina had predicted. I walked boldly into the main aisle, making no attempt to hide my presence. "Richard!" I called cheerfully, as if I'd just arrived for a pleasant social visit. "How lovely to see you!" The entire group froze. Richard's face cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation before settling on forced pleasantness. "Rose, this is unexpected. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how the renovation was coming along. The building has such beautiful potential." I could see Patricia and the fake Nora exchanging worried glances. The man with Richard had his hand inside his jacket, clearly reaching for a weapon. "Actually, this isn't a good time," Richard said smoothly. "We're conducting some private business here." "Oh, I'm sorry. Don't mind me, I'll just look around for a few minutes and then get out of your way." I started walking slowly toward the front of the church, hoping to draw them away from the basement entrance. David mentioned you might be interested in additional architectural consultation. Has he spoken with you about that? Richard's eyes narrowed. David has been uncooperative recently. Well, you know how young people can be. Sometimes they need time to think things through. I was stalling, trying to give David and Nina time to get the evidence and escape, but I could see Richard losing patience with the conversation. Rose, I think you should leave now. Of course. That's when I heard the basement door slam shut, followed by Nina's voice shouting, "Got them!" Richard spun toward the sound, his face contorting with rage. "Patricia, check the basement!" But before anyone could move, David's voice came from the church entrance. "FBI! Nobody move!" Of course, it wasn't really the FBI. It was David using the voice training I'd taught him years ago when he was interested in theater. But in the acoustics of an empty church, it was convincing enough to freeze everyone for a crucial few seconds. That's when Nina burst through the basement door, clutching a bag full of computer drives and financial documents. "Run!" she shouted. And for the next 60 seconds, the Gothic Revival Church became the scene of the most chaotic escape in my investigative career. I dove behind a pew as the armed man finally drew his weapon. Patricia lunged for Nina, but tripped over a gasoline can, sending fuel splashing across the wooden floor. The fake Nora screamed and ran toward the exit, abandoning her criminal family with impressive speed. Richard grabbed for Nina, but she threw the bag of evidence to David, who was standing in the doorway. David caught it and immediately sprinted toward our cars. I rolled behind another pew and made my way toward the entrance, while Richard and the gunman argued about whether to chase us or destroy the remaining evidence. By the time I reached the parking lot, David had already loaded the evidence into my car, and Nina was climbing into the passenger seat. "Drive!" Nina shouted as I started the engine. I drove directly to the New Haven FBI office, calling Maria Santos on the way to let her know we were coming with evidence of federal crimes. As we pulled into the FBI parking lot, Nina turned to David with tears in her eyes. "I know you probably hate me," she said, "but I need you to know, falling in love with you was the only real thing in 3 years of lies." David looked at her for a long moment. "What's going to happen to you now?" "I'll probably go to prison. I participated in the scheme, even if I was trying to get out." She wiped her eyes. "But at least Robert won't hurt anyone else." As we walked into the FBI office with our evidence bags, I realized that the woman who'd thrown wine in my face 6 days ago was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd chosen to risk everything to protect the people she loved, even though she knew it would cost her everything she'd built with lies. Sometimes the most important transformations happen when people think no one is watching. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom in New Haven watching Robert Brennan, formerly Richard Blackwell, receive a sentence of 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Patricia got 12 years. The fake Nora, whose real name was Jessica, got 7 years after testifying against the others. Nina, the real Nina, received 2 years probation and community service in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation. She'd spent 3 weeks in federal custody, helping investigators trace the money and contact the victims. The evidence we'd gathered from the church basement had been crucial in unraveling the entire operation. The $3.5 million stolen from investors was mostly recovered from offshore accounts. The investors would get back about 80 cents on every dollar they'd lost. Not perfect, but better than the total loss they'd been facing. David was sitting beside me in the courtroom, no longer the confused young man who'd been manipulated by professional criminals. The divorce from Nina had been finalized 2 months ago, a legal necessity, since their marriage had been built on false identities and fraudulent documents. But to my surprise, David had also been visiting Nina regularly since she'd started her community service at a Hartford nonprofit that helped fraud victims navigate the legal system. They were trying to build something new, a relationship based on truth instead of lies. "Do you think she really loves me?" David had asked me last week. "Or is she just grateful that I don't hate her?" "I think," I'd replied, "that she fell in love with you despite everything she'd been trained to do. And I think you fell in love with who she really is underneath all the lies. Whether they could build a future together remained to be seen. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, doesn't rebuild quickly or easily. But they were both committed to trying, which was more than I'd expected after the chaos of that investigation. As for me, the 6 months since that wine glass hit my face had transformed my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. The story of our investigation had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across the country. I'd been asked to consult on 3 other financial fraud cases, using my combination of police experience and mother's intuition to spot patterns other investigators missed. Maria Santos and I had even discussed starting a private investigation firm specializing in family-based financial crimes. Apparently, there was a surprising demand for investigators who understood the emotional dynamics that made family members vulnerable to manipulation. But the most important change was in my relationship with David. The crisis had forced us to trust each other completely, and we'd emerged from it closer than we'd been since he was a child. He'd learned that his mother's protective instincts weren't overprotective interference. They were the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of the world to recognize danger before it struck. After the sentencing, David and I walked out of the courthouse into a beautiful April afternoon. Nina was waiting on the steps, having attended the hearing to see Robert face justice for crimes that went back years before she'd met my son. "How do you feel?" I asked her. "Relieved," she said honestly, "and scared. I've been living with false identities for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be myself." "Being yourself is overrated," I said with a smile. "The important thing is deciding who you want to become." We walked toward our cars, 3 people whose lives had been completely upended by professional criminals who'd thought they were smarter than everyone else. We'd survived, they hadn't, and that felt like enough justice for one day. "Mom," David said as we reached my car, "thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me when I was too blind to see what was happening. For trusting your instincts when I couldn't trust mine. For fighting for me when I didn't know I needed fighting for." I smiled at my son, my brave, honest, slightly naive son who'd learned the hard way that sometimes the people who love you have to save you from yourself. "That's what mothers do," I said. "We see the wine glasses coming before they hit your face." As I drove home to my modest house in Stamford, I thought about that birthday party 6 months ago. Nora Blackwell throwing wine in my face had been meant to humiliate me, to put me in my place, to remind me that I was just a working-class widow who didn't belong in their world. Instead, it had awakened something in me that had been sleeping for 3 years. It had reminded me that I was Rose Hammond, former detective, and that I knew how to investigate, how to fight, and how to protect the people I loved. The wine stains had come out of my blouse eventually. The satisfaction of watching professional criminals face justice for their crimes? That was permanent. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is making sure the truth finally comes to light, no matter how many lies people have built their lives on. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, saving someone from their own bad judgment turns out to save you too.